Hello and welcome to VCF Automation 9.1 Greenfield Setup. My name is Mahar Al-Asfar and I am a product marketing engineer within the VMware Cloud Foundation division at Broadcom. In part 4 of this series, we will discuss and demo the infrastructure policy, which is a new feature in VCF Automation 9.1. Before we jump into the demo, you can see the VCF 9.1 lab diagram on the screen. I highly recommend watching part 1 of this series if you have not already. That video provides the full context for the VCF 9.1 infrastructure we are using and how the environment was initially set up. With that out of the way, let's jump right in. In VCF Automation 9.1, provider administrators can now create an infrastructure policy that defines the VM placement on specific hosts that we then assign to one or more organization region quotas to make it available as a mandatory or optional policy. Let's see how that works in our lab environment. The infrastructure policy is built upon vCenter compute policy to enforce that placement. Therefore, let's log into our VI workload domain vCenter using the vSphere client. We'll provide the administrator user and password, of course. And as we previously saw in the lab diagram, this is the vCenter hosting the supervisor, which is part of the US East region. Now, to access the compute policy, we click on the top left burger menu, and we click on policies and profiles, and then click on compute policies. We can see we have two compute policy. They're of the VM host affinity type. The only two compute policy that we can create or map to an infrastructure policy in VCF Automation are the VM host affinity or anti-affinity. Those are the only two supported compute policy that you can map in VCF Automation. So if we scroll to the right, we can see the VM tags and the host tag that the policy is using. So for the Windows workloads, the VMs will have a Windows tag, and for the Linux workloads, the VM will have a Linux tag. These tags are part of the operating system category. Now on the host side, we're saying that for the host will have the Windows workload host tag to place the Windows workloads, and the host that has the Linux workload host tag will run the Linux workloads. Okay, so if we go back to the vSphere client and go to host and cluster and select one of our hosts, so this is the 09 host, and scroll down to the tags widget, you can see that 09 has the Linux workloads host. Host 10 also have the Linux workloads host. So 09 and 010 is going to be used to place Linux workloads on, and however, host 11 has the Windows workloads host. So this is, for example, the host that we're planning to run the Windows workloads on. Now, if we switch to VCFA, we can use the VCFA provider management UI to view the available vCenter compute policy that we just looked at. So to sign into the provider management portal, we'll pass system as the organization name, and then we'll provide the provider administrator username and password. And then on the left-hand side, we can see infrastructure policies in the menu. So if we click on it, we can see that we don't have any infrastructure policy created as of yet. However, if we click on the vCenter compute policy, we can see those two VM host affinity compute policy that was created in the workload domain vCenter, and we can see the FQDN of the vCenter where these policy exists. Now let's go ahead and create our infrastructure policy. So the first one I'm going to create is for the Linux VM host affinity, and from the compute policy, I'm going to select the corresponding Linux VM host affinity compute policy. Now we have the policy enforcement criteria. We can use this to define the rules for which OS or OS family or labels can this infrastructure policy apply to. So we'll add a rule, and we're going to say if the guest OS family equal Linux, then that would be the policy enforcement criteria. Now we have two options here. We can make this policy mandatory by checking the box. This makes this mandatory policy when we assign it to the region quota for an organization. And then the mandatory policy usually will apply to all the VMs in the namespace where the infrastructure policy is applicable. Let's go ahead and submit. The next infrastructure policy we're going to create is for the Windows VM host affinity, and we'll map that to the Windows VM host affinity compute policy. Similarly, we're going to go and create a policy enforcement criteria to say any guest OS family equaling Windows, apply this policy on. And just for the demo purposes, we will not make this a mandatory so we can see the two experiences. So I'm going to leave the checkbox for the mandatory policy, which will make this policy as an optional policy. Okay, so we have our two infrastructure policy. We have the Linux policy as mandatory and the Windows policy as an opt-in or optional infrastructure policy. Now it's time to actually assign it to a tenant. So we have the Acme organization as a tenant. So we can click on it, then we click on region quotas. That's where we can add these infrastructure policy. And because these infrastructure policy are in the vCenter specific to the workload domain that's hosting the supervisor that is a member of the US East region, we can only see and add those policies to the US East region. If you need those same policies to apply in other regions like the US West, then we have to replicate these compute policies in the vCenter hosting the supervisor in the US West region. Let's scroll down to the infrastructure policy section. We'll click edit, and then we can see our policies that we can select. As you can see, the mandatory has this little label says mandatory, and then the optional does not have that label. One caveat here is that you can only add mandatory policies to a region quota as long as there are no existing namespaces in that region within that organization. So therefore, you will have to really plan for all your mandatory policy ahead of time and before the tenant administrator create any namespaces within the organization. We'll click save. We can see our two infrastructure policy have been added. And then we can go and launch the organization portal. Right now, we don't have any services because we have not created any namespaces because we wanted to add the mandatory policy as well. So if we go to manage and govern, we have a sales project. We'll click into it and then we'll click on namespaces. And here we're going to create two namespaces. The first namespace is going to be in a region where we did not define or add any infrastructure policy. So this is going to be Acme Dev. This is going to be in the US West region. So I'm going to select that. And then I'm going to continue through the workflow to add the zone, to add the default VPC, maybe override predefined resource limits, like let's say memory reservation. And as you can see, there was no mention of infrastructure policy. And I'll go and create this namespace. So this was created in a region where infrastructure policy that did not exist. The second policy is going to be in the US East region where we do have infrastructure policy. So if we go through the same workflow, provide the namespace class and select our US East region, select our zone. And as you can see, we have automatically a section that shows up showing us the list of infrastructure policy that can be compatible with this zone that we've selected. The Linux VM host being a mandatory policy, it's already selected. There's no option for you to uncheck it or check it as the org administrator or the project administrator that is creating the namespace. You do have, though, an option to select the optional infrastructure policy to make it available within the namespace that you're creating. We'll continue with the workflow, select our default VPC, maybe add our shared subnet, and hit create. Now, once the namespace is created, we can expand it by the double arrows. And if we scroll down, we can inspect what infrastructure policy has been added here. So as you can see, the Linux VM host affinity is mandatory. So any virtual machine that you're going to provision that has a Linux guest OS, it's going to automatically be tagged with the Linux VM tag. And because of the policy, it will be placed only on host 9 and host 10 who has the Linux workloads tag. As for the Windows VM host, because it's optional, this is something that the user can select. So if we go to the Acme production, which was created in the US East region, and try to create, let's say, a virtual machine, the user has the option to select the infrastructure policy from the drop-down menu because the Windows VM host affinity happens to be an optional infrastructure policy made available by either the org administrator or the project administrator. Now, if you have namespaces spanning multiple zones, or if a zone has multiple clusters, we encourage you to check out our technical documentation for the infrastructure policy requirements and compliancy rules. This concludes our Part 4 Organization Infrastructure Policy in VCF Automation 9.1. Hope you enjoyed it, and thank you for watching.